soft hum of the airplane engines filled the luxurious first-class cabin, where passengers settled into their plush leather seats, adjusting their reclining features and sipping on complimentary champagne. It was the kind of environment where business executives, celebrities, and politicians often found themselves. A man in his mid-40s, dressed in a tailored gray suit, leaned back with an air of confidence. His name was Eric Simmons, a corporate consultant who prided himself on his knowledge of politics and current events. He had spent years cultivating a sharp, often sarcastic wit when it came to discussing politicians, especially those he disagreed with. And on this flight, he was in the mood for a debate. Seated just across from him was a blonde woman, elegant but unassuming, dressed in a sleek navy blue pantsuit. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her posture relaxed but poised. She seemed familiar, yet Eric couldn't quite place her. But something about her demeanor, too composed, too refined, bothered him. As the flight attendant made her way down the aisle, offering warm hand towels, Eric took the opportunity to strike up a conversation. He turned toward the woman, flashing a knowing smirk. "You look like someone important," he said, his voice laced with playful sarcasm. "Politician, maybe?" The woman glanced at him, a polite but guarded smile appearing on her lips. "Something like that," she replied. Eric chuckled. "Ah, let me guess. Another Washington bureaucrat flying first class on taxpayer dollars?" He took a sip of his champagne, watching for her reaction. She didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly set down her glass of water and looked at him with a measured gaze. "I'm flying on my own dime," she said. "But I suppose that's not what you want to hear." Eric laughed, shaking his head. "No offense, but I've got a pretty good sense of who's who in politics, and you look like one of those conservative types, am I right?" The woman tilted her head slightly. "What makes you say that?" He shrugged. "It's just an instinct. You've got that polished, lawyerly look. Probably one of those right-wingers who goes on TV defending the indefensible." At this, the woman let out a soft chuckle. "You seem very sure of yourself." Eric leaned forward, resting his elbow on the armrest. "I follow politics pretty closely, and let's be honest, most of you conservative types have the same script. Law and order, family values, the Constitution. I could practically recite your talking points myself." The woman smiled, but there was something in her expression that hinted at amusement rather than offense. "Well," she said, "it's always interesting to hear how people perceive things." Eric smirked. "Oh, come on, you can't tell. You're not a politician, or at least connected to them. What's your name anyway?" She hesitated for just a moment before extending her hand. "Pam Bondi." The moment the name left her lips, Eric's confident smirk flickered. His mind raced, the name striking a chord. It took him only a few seconds to connect the dots. Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida, a staunch defender of law and order. A woman who had gone head-to-head with some of the most powerful figures in the country. He had seen her on TV delivering sharp legal arguments with an unshakable conviction. She had been an advisor, a prosecutor, a high-profile figure in American politics. And here he was, sitting across from her, having just made a complete fool of himself. For the first time in their conversation, Eric hesitated. His usual quick wit failed him as he processed the realization. He had spent the last 10 minutes making snide remarks about conservatives, about her, without even realizing who he was talking to. Pam noticed the change in his demeanor. Her expression remained composed, but her eyes carried a knowing glint. "You recognize me now, don't you?" she asked, her voice steady. Eric cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how small the first-class cabin felt. Yeah, I do." Pam leaned back in her seat, taking a slow sip of her water. "You seem like someone who enjoys a good debate," she said. "I take it you don't agree with my politics?" Eric forced a chuckle, trying to regain some of his previous confidence. "Well, let's just say I've had my fair share of disagreements with your viewpoints." Pam nodded. "That's fair, but tell me something. Do you always start conversations by making assumptions about people? Eric exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Okay, I'll admit, that wasn't exactly my finest moment. She smiled. We all do it sometimes, but here's the thing. When you assume, you close yourself off to learning. You've already decided who I am before you've even asked me a single real question. Eric sighed, realizing she was right. He had jumped to conclusions, eager to get in a few clever jabs without actually understanding the person sitting across from him. Pam continued, her voice calm but firm. I've spent my career fighting for justice. That doesn't mean I expect everyone to agree with me, but I do expect conversations to be built on something more than just preconceptions. Eric met her gaze, feeling a rare sense of humility wash over him. He had entered this conversation thinking he was the sharp one, the witty intellectual ready to dismantle a so-called conservative. Instead, he had been schooled in the simplest lesson of all: respect. The flight attendant returned, offering both of them refills. Eric hesitated, then lifted his glass slightly. To learning something new, he said, offering a small, self-aware smile. Pam clinked her glass against his. To conversations that matter. For the rest of the flight, their discussion took on a different tone. They didn't agree on everything, but for the first time, Eric found himself listening. Really, listening. And as the plane touched down, he realized that for all his confidence, he had been given an unexpected lesson in humility. Pam Bondi had left an impression on him, not just as a political figure, but as a person. And as he grabbed his briefcase and stepped off the plane, he knew one thing for certain. He would never make the mistake of underestimating someone like her again. Eric shifted in his seat, still feeling the sting of embarrassment. He had prided himself on being well-informed, yet he had just made assumptions about one of the most prominent legal figures in the country. He wasn't used to being wrong, and certainly not in such a public setting. Pam, however, seemed unbothered. She wasn't gloating or rubbing it in. She simply sipped her water and waited, giving him space to process his realization. After a brief silence, Eric finally spoke. I guess I walked right into that one, huh? He admitted with a self-deprecating chuckle. Pam smiled but didn't say anything right away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him. You tell me, she said. Eric sighed, rubbing his temple. Look, I won't lie, I've been critical of you before. I've seen you on TV, I know your stance on things, and, well, let's just say I've argued against you more than once. Pam raised an eyebrow. Argued against me? In what way? Eric leaned back in his seat, loosening his tie slightly. I work as a consultant. Big corporate clients, legal teams, some media work. I've been in plenty of debates where your name has come up. You're polarizing, to say the least. Pam let out a soft laugh. I've heard that before. Eric hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. But I'll admit something. I never actually listened to you. I only heard the clips that fit the narrative I already believed. Pam nodded. That's more common than you think, and not just with me, with politics in general. Eric exhaled, staring at his untouched champagne. You really believe in what you do, don't you? Pam's expression turned serious. Of course I do. Do you think I would have taken on some of the cases I did if I didn't? Eric thought back to her legal career, her battles against powerful figures, her unwavering stance on justice. Whether or not he agreed with her, politics, he couldn't deny one thing. She wasn't in it for fame or fortune. She genuinely believed in what she stood for. Pam continued. People assume politicians and public figures are all playing a game. And sure, some are. But for me, it's always been about doing what's right, even when it's unpopular. Eric studied her for a moment, then smirked. So, tell me, how does it feel to be the most controversial person on a plane ride? Pam chuckled. Oh, I've been through worse. This is just an interesting conversation. Eric shook his head in amusement. He had expected an argument, a heated debate where both of them stubbornly held their ground. Instead, he had been met with patience, confidence, and something he didn't anticipate: respect. As the flight continued, their conversation took a more personal turn. Pam shared stories from her career, cases that had kept her up at night, decisions that had weighed on her, moments where she had questioned everything. Eric, in turn, shared his own experiences, his frustrations with the political climate, his disillusionment with the way people no longer talked, but simply yelled past each other. By the time the flight began its descent, Eric felt like he had just gone through an intellectual workout. Pam glanced out the window, then turned back to him. "So, what's your takeaway from this?" Eric exhaled, shaking his head with a chuckle. "That I need to stop thinking I have everyone figured out before I even meet them." Pam smiled. "Not a bad realization." As the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign dinged, Eric extended his hand. "For what it's worth, I might not agree with you, but I respect you." Pam shook his hand firmly. "That's all I could ask for." As Eric stepped off the plane, he knew one thing for certain. He had boarded the flight expecting just another routine trip. Instead, he had walked away with something far more valuable: a new perspective. And as he disappeared into the crowd, he had a feeling he wouldn't forget this flight anytime soon. As Eric made his way through the bustling airport terminal, he found himself replaying the conversation in his mind. He had spent years engaging in political debates, but few had left an impact like this one. There was something about the way Pam Bondi had handled herself, calm, unshaken, and unwilling to take the bait, that made him respect her, even if he disagreed with her politics. He pulled out his phone and did something he never thought he'd do. He looked up some of Pam's speeches. Not just the clips he had seen on the news, but full interviews, press conferences, and courtroom arguments. He wanted to hear her in context, not just through the lens of whichever media outlet had chosen to frame her words. As he scrolled through articles and videos while waiting for his luggage, one particular interview caught his eye. It was a discussion about a case she had prosecuted involving a massive fraud operation that had preyed on elderly citizens. She had gone after them relentlessly, ensuring that justice was served. Eric furrowed his brows, watching the footage. He had always seen her as just another conservative talking head, but here she was, fighting for people who had been taken advantage of, people who had lost everything. He wasn't expecting to be moved, but he was. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Deep in research, Eric turned to see Pam standing a few feet away, rolling her carry-on luggage. He let out a surprised chuckle. "You caught me," he admitted. She smirked. "I was wondering if you were going to fact-check me." Eric shrugged. "I guess I just realized I never gave you a fair shake before. I've been watching some of your old interviews." Pam nodded. "And?" Eric hesitated before responding. "And maybe I judged you too quickly. I still don't agree with a lot of your views, but I can see that you care. That's more than I can say for a lot of people in politics." Pam smiled. "I appreciate that. You know, if more people actually listened to each other instead of assuming the worst, we might get somewhere." Eric exhaled, shaking his head with amusement. "I never thought I'd be standing in an airport admitting that Pam Bondi made me rethink some things." Pam chuckled. "Life's funny like that." They stood there for a moment before an airport announcement crackled over the speakers. "Well," Pam said, adjusting the strap on her bag, "I have a meeting to get to." Eric extended his hand. "Good luck with it. And for what it's worth, I'll be paying a little more attention next time I see you on TV." Pam shook his hand. "I'll take that as progress." With that, she turned and walked toward the exit, disappearing into the crowd. Eric stood there for a moment, processing everything that had just happened. He had boarded that flight thinking he knew everything about the woman sitting across from him. Instead, he had left with a lesson in humility, respect, and the importance of seeing people as individuals, not just as political labels. As he picked up his bag and headed toward his own destination, he couldn't help but smile. Some flights change your plans. Others change your perspective. And this one? This one had changed him. As Eric made his way toward the airport exit, his mind kept circling back to the conversation he'd just had. It wasn't every day that someone shook his worldview, especially someone he had spent years dismissing as just another political figure. He pulled out his phone again, hesitating for a moment before typing Pam Bondi into a search engine. This time, he wasn't looking for negative headlines or opinion pieces. He wanted to see her actual work, the cases she had taken on, the causes she had championed. Scrolling through articles, he found something that caught his attention, a lawsuit she had led against major pharmaceutical companies over the opioid crisis. He clicked on an old press conference video, watching as she spoke with unwavering conviction about holding corporations accountable for the damage they had done to families across the country. Eric's jaw tightened. His own cousin had struggled with opioid addiction, nearly losing everything in the process. He had blamed the system, the companies, the negligence, but he had never realized that Pam Bondi had been one of the people actually fighting that battle. He swallowed hard, a pang of guilt creeping in. He had mocked her, written her off. But here she was, standing up for victims like his cousin, fighting the same fight he had always wanted to see someone take seriously. He leaned against a pillar near the baggage claim, lost in thought. Maybe he had been too quick to assume. Maybe there was more to people like Pam Bondi than what the media on either side had led him to believe. A voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Hey, you okay?" Eric turned to see a younger man, probably in his early 30s, looking at him with concern. He had a military-style haircut and a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Yeah," Eric said, shaking himself out of it. "Just thinking." The man nodded. "Saw you watching that video of Pam Bondi. She's tough. My dad was one of the guys who got justice because of that opioid lawsuit. She went after those companies harder than anyone." Eric blinked. "Really?" The man nodded. "Yeah. My dad lost his job, his house, everything. We thought we'd never get any accountability. But she didn't just talk. She actually did something." Eric exhaled, nodding slowly. "I didn't know that." The man gave him a knowing smile. "Most people don't. They just hear the headlines. Anyway, take care, man." As the young man walked away, Eric stood there for a moment, his phone still in his hand. This wasn't just some random conversation on a plane anymore. This was a wake-up call. Eric had spent years believing he had all the answers, that his side was always right, and that people like Pam Bondi were just part of the problem. But today, he had seen something different. He wasn't about to change all his beliefs overnight. But one thing was for sure. He was done assuming. As he stepped outside into the fresh air, he made a silent promise to himself. From now on, he would listen before judging. Because sometimes the people you think you know are the ones who surprise you the most. And this time, he was the one walking away.